I remember the exact moment my son decided to destroy me, and I remember choosing to let him. Selfish shrew. Daniel's voice cut through the room, sharp and deliberate, echoing against the polished wood walls of the attorney's office as 27 relatives turned to stare at me, their conversations dying mid-sentence, their expressions shifting from polite grief to something far more curious, far more cruel. I didn't flinch, not when he stood there in his tailored navy suit, not when his finger pointed in my direction as if I were something to be judged, not even when Vanessa, seated beside him, let out a soft, practiced gasp that sounded just convincing enough to pass for shock, because I had already decided, long before this moment, that I would not give them the reaction they were waiting for. I simply adjusted the thin gold band on my finger, the one Richard had slipped on my hand 43 years ago, and I looked at my son as if he were a stranger whose voice I had never heard before, the kind of stranger who mistakes noise for power, the kind who believes that volume can rewrite truth, the kind who doesn't realize that some rooms remember everything, including silence. And the room was very quiet now. So quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock behind Mr. Klein's desk, each second stretching longer than the last, each glance from across the room lingering just a little too long, as if everyone had been waiting for something like this to happen, but no one had expected it to arrive so openly, so boldly. Daniel's chest rose and fell as he prepared to say more, but I didn't give him that moment. Not yet. I let him stand there, let him feel the weight of every eye in that room, let him believe he had already won, because sometimes the most effective way to understand a person is to let them finish revealing themselves. And I wanted everyone in that room to hear exactly who my son had become, not the boy who used to reach for my hand when he crossed the street, not the young man who once promised me he would always take care of me, but the man, standing there now, fueled by something colder, something rehearsed, something that had been building long before today. And as I looked past him, I noticed the subtle shift in the room, the way a few relatives exchanged glances, the way one of my sisters lowered her eyes as if she suddenly didn't want to be part of this, the way Mr. Klein hesitated with the folder still closed in his hands, waiting, watching, measuring, because he knew something the rest of them didn't. And I knew it too. I had known it since the morning Richard signed the final document, since the moment he looked at me with that quiet certainty and said, "Let them show you who they are." And now they were right here in front of everyone, without restraint, without shame. Daniel took a step forward, ready to continue his performance, ready to turn the room fully against me. And I let him. I let every second pass exactly as it needed to, because what he didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that this moment, this loud, humiliating, carefully staged accusation was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more permanent. And as I finally lifted my gaze to meet his, steady and unshaken, I realized that for the first time in years, I felt completely certain of one thing. I didn't need to defend myself. I only needed to let the truth arrive in its own time. Daniel did not sit down after his outburst. And that was the first sign that this was not emotion, but intention, because grief makes people collapse inward, but performance makes them stand taller. And he stood there now with his shoulders squared, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, as if he had practiced the tone, the timing, even the way his voice would carry across the room. And I noticed how Vanessa reached for his arm, her fingers resting lightly against his sleeve, not to stop him, but to steady the scene, to frame him as the wounded son rather than the aggressor. And it was a small gesture, almost invisible, but I had learned over the years that the smallest gestures often carried the most meaning, especially when they were repeated often enough to become instinct. And around us the room began to shift in quiet, subtle ways. Chairs creaked as people adjusted their posture. A cousin near the back leaned forward slightly as if trying to catch every word. Someone near the window exhaled a long, slow breath that sounded almost like relief, because discomfort shared among a group has a way of turning into something else, something closer to permission, and I could feel it settling over the room now, that permission to judge, to assume, to believe the version of the story that was being handed to them in a voice loud enough to drown out anything quieter. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone lower this time, but no less sharp, as he began to list the grievances he had carried, or perhaps collected, over the years, saying that I had controlled every decision in the house, that I had isolated his father from the rest of the family, that I had made myself the center of everything while pretending it was sacrifice, and each accusation was delivered with the confidence of someone who expected agreement, not resistance. And I noticed how a few heads nodded, just slightly, just enough to confirm that doubt had already been planted long before today, because doubt does not appear suddenly. It grows in the spaces where trust has been quietly replaced. And I realized then that this moment had not started in this room. It had started months ago, maybe even years ago, in conversations I was never part of, in decisions that were explained to me only after they had already been made, in invitations that arrived later and later until they stopped arriving at all. And as Daniel continued, I let my gaze move across the faces in front of me, taking in each reaction carefully, not to defend myself, but to understand exactly where I stood, because there is a difference between being alone and being removed, and what I saw in that room was not hostility from everyone, but something more complicated, a quiet willingness to accept whatever version of the truth required the least effort to question. Mr. Klein cleared his throat softly, a sound that might have gone unnoticed if the room had not been so still, and he adjusted the papers in his hands with a precision that suggested hesitation rather than preparation, his eyes flicking briefly toward me before returning to Daniel, as if he were waiting for a signal that had not yet been given, and I understood then that timing mattered more than anything else, that there was a moment when truth could enter a room and be heard, and a moment when it would be dismissed before it was even spoken. And this was not yet that moment, so I remained exactly as I was, seated, composed, my hands resting calmly in my lap, while Daniel reached the peak of his speech, his voice rising again as he concluded with a final statement about fairness, about what he deserved, about what should have been his all along. And when he finished, there was a pause, not long, but long enough for expectation to settle in, long enough for every eye to turn back to me, waiting for denial, for anger, for something that would match the intensity of what had just been said, but I gave them none of that. I simply held Daniel's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then shifted my attention to Mr. Klein and spoke in a voice so even it felt almost out of place in the tension that filled the room, asking him, with quiet clarity, to please continue reading the will. And in that instant, something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because for the first time since Daniel had spoken, the focus moved away from his words and toward what had yet to be revealed, and I saw it in the way his expression faltered, just slightly, just enough to betray the first hint of uncertainty, and that was when I knew that whatever he believed this moment to be, it was no longer entirely under his control. Mr. Klein did not open the folder immediately after I spoke, and that hesitation, small as it was, carried more weight than anything Daniel had said, because it introduced something unfamiliar into the room, something quieter than accusation, but far more unsettling, uncertainty, and I watched as Daniel shifted his stance just slightly, the confidence that had filled his posture a moment ago beginning to loosen at the edges, while Vanessa's hand slipped away from his arm, not dramatically, just enough to create distance, as if she no longer needed to anchor him now that the attention had begun to drift, and in that subtle withdrawal, I saw the first fracture in whatever certainty they had built between them. Mr. Klein adjusted his glasses and finally opened the folder, the sound of paper sliding against paper breaking the stillness in a way that felt deliberate, measured, as if each movement was being given its own space to settle. And when he began to read, his voice was calm, professional, almost detached, but there was a precision to it that demanded attention. He started with the formal language, the acknowledgments, the standard phrasing that often passes unnoticed in moments like these. But no one in that room was ignoring anything now. Every word seemed to land with a weight that had not been there before, and I could feel the shift happening slowly, not in what was being said, but in how it was being received, because the louder Daniel had been, the more people were now leaning into the quiet, searching for something that might either confirm or challenge what they had just witnessed. And as Mr. Klein continued, I let my attention drift briefly, not away from the moment, but through it, back to the morning Richard and I had sat, together at the kitchen table, the sunlight coming in through the window, just as it always had, warm and steady, and the way he had looked at me then, not with worry, not with hesitation, but with the kind of clarity that only comes when someone has already made peace with a decision. He had not explained everything. He did not need to. He simply placed his hand over mine and said, "You will know when it matters." And I had trusted that, not because I understood it fully, but because I understood him. And now, sitting in that room, I could feel that trust settling into place, aligning with the moment as it unfolded. Mr. Klein's voice moved through the document with steady rhythm, outlining distributions, responsibilities, acknowledgments of contributions made over the years. And with each line, I noticed the subtle changes around me. The way a cousin who had been leaning toward Daniel now sat back slightly. The way one of Vanessa's relatives glanced at her with a flicker of something that looked almost like doubt. And Daniel himself, who had once filled the room with his presence, now seemed to be listening in a way he had not intended, his expression tightening not in anger, but in calculation, as if he were trying to anticipate something he could no longer fully predict. And then there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, as Mr. Klein reached a section that required more care. He lifted his eyes for a fraction of a second, not to the room, but to me, and in that glance there was confirmation, not of victory, not of triumph, but of timing, the kind that cannot be rushed or forced, only recognized. And I gave the slightest nod, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to continue. And when he did, his tone shifted just enough to signal that what followed was not standard, not expected, but intentional. And I felt the room leaning again, not physically, but collectively, the air tightening with attention. And for the first time since Daniel had spoken, I saw something different in his eyes, not confidence, not anger, but the early edge of realization, the kind that begins quietly before it fully takes hold. And I knew then that whatever he had believed about this moment, whatever story he had prepared himself to tell, was no longer the only version that mattered, because the truth was no longer waiting. It had begun to speak, and it would not need to raise its voice to be heard. The words that followed did not arrive like a shock. They arrived like a quiet correction, and that made them far more powerful, because Mr. Klein did not raise his voice. He did not pause for effect. He simply continued reading in the same steady tone. But now each sentence carried a precision that cut through everything Daniel had tried to establish moments earlier. The document began outlining a series of amendments that had been added in the final months of Richard's life, amendments that were not emotional or reactive, but deliberate, structured, and carefully worded. And as those words filled the room, I could feel the atmosphere shifting again, not with the tension of confrontation, but with the weight of realization settling into place, the kind that does not ask for permission. It simply replaces what was there before. Mr. Klein described how Richard had reviewed all major financial accounts, how he had reassessed property ownership, how he had documented not only assets, but also patterns, decisions, and influences that had shaped those decisions in recent years. And at the mention of that word, influences, I noticed Vanessa's posture change, just slightly, the composure she had maintained beginning to tighten, her hands folding together in her lap as if holding something in place, while Daniel's attention sharpened in a different way now, no longer projecting outward, but turning inward, calculating, listening more carefully than he had intended to, because control requires certainty, and certainty was beginning to slip. Mr. Klein continued, explaining that Richard had not acted out of suspicion, but out of clarity, that he had taken time to observe changes within the family, shifts in communication, in decision-making and access, and that he had chosen to document those observations in a way that would ensure fairness, not just in distribution, but in accountability. And the word accountability seemed to linger in the room longer than the others, as if it had weight of its own, and I saw it reflected in the faces around me. The quiet recalibration of assumptions, the subtle distancing from the narrative that had been so confidently presented just minutes before. Daniel shifted his weight again, this time less controlled, his jaw tightening as if he were trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had expected, and Vanessa glanced toward him, not with reassurance, but with something closer to concern, the kind that appears when a plan begins to reveal gaps. Mr. Klein then reached a section that outlined conditional provisions, and though he did not emphasize the words, their meaning was unmistakable. Richard had included specific clauses tied to conduct, to respect, to the preservation of family integrity. And while the language remained formal, its intent was clear enough for everyone in that room to understand that inheritance, in his view, was not simply a matter of entitlement, but of character, and that character, once revealed, could not be ignored. I did not look at Daniel when those words were read. I did not need to, because the silence that followed told me everything I needed to. No, it was no longer the silence of anticipation, but the silence of recognition, the kind that settles over a room when something undeniable has been placed in front of it. And I let that silence remain untouched, because breaking it too soon would only diminish what it had already begun to do. Mr. Klein paused briefly, turning a page with careful precision, and in that moment I allowed myself to breathe a little. Deeper, not out of relief, but out of alignment, because this was not about proving anything. It was about allowing what had already been set in motion to reach its natural conclusion. And as he prepared to continue, I noticed Daniel's shoulders no longer held the same certainty they had at the beginning. They had lowered just slightly, as if the weight of something unseen had settled there. And Vanessa, who had once leaned into him for support, now sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed forward, avoiding the eyes of those around her. And I understood then that the shift was no longer subtle. It had begun to take shape in ways that could not be reversed, because once a room begins to see differently, it does not easily return to what it believed before, and whatever remained to be read, whatever details had yet to be revealed, were no longer entering a space controlled by assumption, but one prepared, finally, to listen. Mr. Klein turned the page with a careful, almost deliberate slowness. And this time he did not begin immediately. He allowed the silence to settle just a second longer than before, as if even he understood that what came next required the room to be fully present. And when he finally spoke again, his tone remained measured, but there was a new clarity to it, a firmness that suggested the words were no longer simply informational. They were decisive. He began outlining a final addendum, one that Richard had insisted be included as a direct reflection of his intentions, not only for the distribution of his estate, but for the preservation of what he had built over a lifetime. And as those words unfolded, the structure of everything Daniel had assumed began to shift in a way that could not be ignored. The addendum specified that all primary assets, including the family home, investment accounts, and business holdings, would remain under my sole authority. Not temporarily, not conditionally, but entirely, with full discretion over their future use and distribution. And I could feel the subtle ripple move through the room. Not loud, not disruptive, but undeniable, the kind of movement that happens when expectation collides with reality and loses. Daniel's expression tightened further, his lips pressing together as if holding back a response he no longer felt confident delivering, while Vanessa's composure faltered just enough for it to be seen, her eyes lowering briefly before lifting again, searching the room as if trying to measure how much had already changed. Mr. Klein continued, and this time the language grew even more precise, outlining a series of conditions tied specifically to any future claims against the estate, conditions that were not punitive but protective, ensuring that any challenge, any attempt to undermine the integrity of the will, would result in immediate forfeiture of any remaining claims. And the weight of that clause did not need to be explained. It settled into the room on its own, clear and absolute, and I noticed how several relatives exchanged glances again. But this time there was no curiosity in them, only understanding, the kind that comes too late to be useful. Daniel shifted once more, but now there was no performance left in the movement, only discomfort, the realization that whatever narrative he had prepared no longer aligned with what was being presented. And I watched him, carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet recognition of how far things had moved from what they once were, because there had been a time when his voice did not need to rise to be heard, when trust did not need to be questioned, when presence alone was enough. But that time had passed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but through a series of small, almost unnoticeable shifts that had accumulated into something irreversible. Mr. Klein reached the final lines of the addendum, and his voice slowed slightly, not for effect, but for clarity, as he read Richard's own words, carefully written, deliberately placed, stating that respect within a family is not optional, that it is the foundation upon which everything else rests, and that any action that publicly undermines that foundation reveals more than it conceals. And as those words settled into the room, I did not need to look at anyone to know their impact. I could feel it in the stillness, in the absence of movement, in the way even the air seemed to pause. And when Mr. Klein finally closed the folder, the sound was soft, but final, marking the end of something that had already begun to unravel. And I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the silence to complete its work, because there was nothing I needed to add, nothing I needed to defend. Everything that needed to be said had already been placed before them. And as I slowly rose to my feet, I adjusted the sleeve of my coat with the same calm precision I had maintained from the beginning. Then I looked at Daniel, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that no longer required explanation, and in that moment I understood something with absolute certainty. This was never about taking anything from him. It was about allowing him to show, in front of everyone, exactly why he could not be trusted to hold it. No one spoke after I stood up, and that silence was different from the ones before. It was no longer waiting for something to happen. It was absorbing what already had, and I could feel it in the way people avoided sudden movements, in the way even small sounds seemed out of place, as if the room itself had decided that nothing more needed to be added. Daniel did not move at first. He remained where he was, his posture caught somewhere between defiance and uncertainty, as though he had not yet decided which version of himself he would become next. And Vanessa, who had once held herself with such careful composure, now sat perfectly still, her gaze lowered just enough to avoid direct attention, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet calculation that came too late to be useful. I did not rush toward the door. I did not turn away immediately. Instead, I allowed myself one final moment to look around the room, not searching for approval, not measuring reactions, but simply observing. Because there is clarity in seeing things as they are without needing to change them. And what I saw was not a room divided, but a room that had shifted, people who had arrived with assumptions now sitting with something else entirely, something heavier, something less comfortable. And that was enough. Mr. Klein remained near his desk, the folder now closed in his hands, his expression neutral but no longer distant. There was a quiet acknowledgement there, the kind professionals offer when a matter has reached its conclusion without unnecessary disruption. And I inclined my head slightly in his direction, a gesture of understanding more than gratitude, because he had done exactly what was required. Nothing more, nothing less. As I turned toward the door, the sound of my heels against the floor seemed louder than before, each step measured, unhurried, carrying with it the finality that words often fail to achieve. And just as I reached for the handle, Daniel's voice broke through the silence again, but this time it lacked the sharpness it had carried earlier. It was lower, uncertain, as if searching for footing that was no longer there. He called my name, not loudly, not with authority, but with something closer to hesitation, and for a brief moment, I paused, not because I needed to hear what he would say, but because I wanted to understand whether there was anything left in him that recognized what had just happened. I did not turn fully, only enough to acknowledge that I had heard him, and in that partial movement, there was more distance than any words could have created. He began to speak again, something about misunderstanding, about not knowing, about things getting out of hand, but the words did not form into anything complete. They lingered in fragments, unable to carry the certainty they once had, and I listened just long enough to confirm what I already understood, that this was not clarity, it was reaction, not reflection, and those are not the same. So I did not respond, I did not correct him, I did not offer him a way back into the moment he had chosen to define. Instead, I simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of agreement, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, the kind that recognizes that something has been said without giving it the power to change anything. And then I turned the handle and stepped out into the hallway, the door closing behind me with a soft, final sound that did not echo, did not linger. It simply ended. And as I walked down the corridor, away from the room, away from the voices that had filled it, I felt something settle within me. Not relief, not victory, but something steadier. Something that had been building quietly beneath everything else. The understanding that there are moments in life when nothing needs to be taken, nothing needs to be proven, because everything has already been revealed, and all that remains is to walk forward without looking back. The hallway felt different from the room I had just left, quieter in a way that was not heavy, but clean, as if the air itself had been cleared of something that no longer needed to linger. And I continued walking without hesitation, my steps steady, my pace unhurried, not because I had nowhere to go, but because for the first time in a long while, I was not being pulled backward by anything I had left behind. The soft hum of overhead lights accompanied me as I moved down the corridor, each sound simple, predictable, grounded. And that simplicity felt more real than anything that had just unfolded behind that closed door. I reached the end of the hallway where a row of windows overlooked the parking lot, the late afternoon light stretching across the pavement in long, quiet lines, and I paused there, not out of exhaustion, but out of recognition, because moments like this do not come often, moments where everything that needed to reveal itself has already done so, leaving nothing unclear, nothing unresolved, just the quiet certainty of what is. And I placed my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the faint coolness beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something tangible, something steady. And as I stood there, I allowed my thoughts to move, not backward into regret, but across the years with a kind of clarity that had not been possible before. I thought of Richard, not in the way people often do after loss, with longing or unfinished questions, but with understanding, because I could see now what he had seen, the subtle shifts, the quiet changes, the moments that seemed small at the time, but carried more weight than they appeared, the conversations that became shorter, the decisions that began to exclude rather than include, the way Daniel had started to speak not with me, but around me, as if I were no longer part of the center, but something to be managed at the edges. And I remembered the first time I noticed it, truly noticed it, not dismissed it as stress or distance or anything temporary, but recognized it as something intentional, something that had direction. It had been a Sunday afternoon, the kind we used to spend together without effort, and Daniel had visited with Vanessa, but instead of the ease that once filled those visits, there had been a carefulness to everything, the way she answered questions for him, the way he deferred without realizing it, the way decisions were mentioned only after they had already been made. And I had sat there listening, observing, telling myself that families change, that dynamics shift, that this was normal, but deep down, I had felt something else, something quieter, but more certain, a sense that I was no longer being included in the same way. And I had not confronted it then, not because I did not see it, but because I believed time would correct it, that whatever distance had formed would close on its own. But time does not correct what is not acknowledged. It only allows it to deepen. And now, standing here, I understood that what happened in that room was not sudden. It was the result of all those unspoken moments finally reaching a point where they could no longer remain hidden. I'll lower my hand from the glass and straighten slightly, not out of tension, but out of resolve, because clarity does not ask for reaction. It asks for direction, and I knew mine now. It was not about returning to what had been. It was about moving forward with what had been revealed. And as I turned away from the window and began walking again, this time toward the exit, I felt no urgency, no need to escape or to linger, just a steady sense of continuation, the kind that does not depend on anyone else's understanding, the kind that does not require explanation, because everything that needed to be seen had already been placed in front of them, and everything that needed to be understood had already begun to settle. Whether they accepted it or not was no longer mine to carry, and that, more than anything else, was what allowed me to walk forward without hesitation, without doubt, and without looking back. The glass door opened with a soft push, and the air outside carried a different weight, lighter, cooler, untouched by what had just taken place behind me. And as I stepped out onto the concrete walkway, I paused for a brief moment, not because I needed to gather myself, but because I recognized the shift fully now, the separation between what had been and what no longer was. The late afternoon sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot, stretching everything into softer lines, and I took a slow breath, letting that quiet settle around me. Grounding, steady, uncomplicated, I walked toward my car at the same measured pace I kept all day, each step deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. And as I reached into my bag for my keys, I heard the door behind me open again, not loudly, but enough to break the stillness. I did not turn immediately. I already knew who it was. The sound of his steps carried that familiar weight, not confident, not anymore, but searching. Daniel stopped a few feet behind me, close enough for his presence to be felt, but not close enough to reclaim anything that had been lost. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us no longer heavy, just clear, defined. And then he said my name again, this time softer, stripped of performance, stripped of audience, just a word spoken without certainty of how it would be received. I turned slowly, not fully, just enough to meet his eyes. And what I saw, there was not the certainty from before, not the anger, not even the accusation, but something less formed, something unsettled, the early stage of understanding that comes too late to prevent consequence. He began to speak, explaining, not clearly, not confidently, but in fragments, saying he had been misled, that things were not how they seemed, that Vanessa had handled certain matters, that he had trusted what he was told. And as he spoke, I listened, not to the words themselves, but to what they revealed, because explanation is not the same as accountability. And I could hear the difference in every pause, in every shift of his tone. He was not reflecting. He was searching for distance from what had just happened, searching for a way to stand outside of it. And I let him finish, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted him to hear himself, to understand the space between what he was saying and what had already been revealed. When he stopped, the silence returned. But this time it did not belong to the room. It belonged to us, and I held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a clarity that did not need reinforcement. And in that moment, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else that day. This was not about being right. It was about being seen, truly seen, without distortion, without narrative, without the layers that had been built over time. And now that clarity existed, whether he accepted it or not no longer changed anything. I reached into my bag again and took out my keys, the small metallic sound marking a quiet transition. And as I opened the car door, I spoke for the first time since leaving the room, my voice even, steady, without weight, telling him that understanding comes before repair, and that until he could see what had truly happened, not what was convenient to believe, there was nothing left to discuss. I did not wait for a response. I did not leave space for one, because some conversations do not need continuation. They need distance. And I stepped into the car, closing the door with a soft, final sound. And as I started the engine, I glanced once through the windshield, not at him, but ahead, at the road stretching forward, open, uninterrupted, and I drove away without looking back, because everything that needed to be faced had already been left behind. And everything that remained was no longer tied to where I had been, but to where I chose to go next. The road ahead stretched out in long, steady lines, and I kept my eyes on it without distraction. The hum of the engine beneath me, a quiet reminder that movement, once chosen, does not ask for permission to continue. The late afternoon light shifted as I drove, turning softer, more distant, and with each passing mile, the weight of what had happened did not follow me in the way it once might have. It did not cling or press or demand to be revisited. It simply remained where it belonged, behind me, complete in its own way. And as I merged onto the main road, the familiarity of the route settled in. The same turns I'd taken countless times before, now carrying a different meaning. Not because the road had changed, but because I had, and that difference, subtle as it was, shaped everything that followed. I thought again of Richard, not as a presence that was gone, but as a voice that had already said what needed to be said, not in words spoken aloud in that room, but in the choices he had made long before it, in the way he had seen clearly when others preferred comfort over truth. And I understood now that what he left behind was not just structure or protection. It was clarity, the kind that does not fade once it is recognized, the kind that remains steady even when everything else shifts around it. And as I continued driving, I realized that there was no part of me that wanted to return to the moment that had just passed. Not to change it, not to soften it, not even to explain it further, because nothing about it required revision. Everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to, revealing what had been hidden not through force but through its own weight, and that realization settled into me with a quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to be repeated to be understood. When I reached my driveway, I slowed the car and turned in, the familiar outline of the house coming into view, unchanged, steady, waiting, and I parked the car and sat there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, because this space, this place, was no longer connected to the uncertainty that had once surrounded it. It stood as it always had, grounded, real, untouched by the voices that had tried to redefine it. I turned off the engine and stepped out, the air cooler now as evening approached, carrying with it a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. And as I walked toward the front door, I noticed the small details that had always been there, the way the light fell across the steps, the faint sound of leaves shifting in the distance, the quiet consistency of things that do not change simply because people do. And I paused at the door, my hand resting lightly on the handle. And in that moment, I understood something fully, something that had been building through everything that had happened, that respect, once lost, cannot be restored through explanation. It can only be recognized through absence. And what had been revealed today was not just who Daniel had become, but what I no longer needed to carry. I opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house meeting me with a quiet welcome. And I closed the door behind me, not with finality, not with force, but with the simple understanding that what remained outside no longer defined what was within. I moved through the house slowly, not searching for anything, just allowing the space to settle around me. And as I reached the living room, I stopped for a moment, looking at the chair where Richard used to sit, the place that still held his presence in a way that did not require memory to sustain it. And I allowed myself a small, steady breath, not of sadness, not of relief, but of alignment, because everything that needed to be faced had been faced. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen, and everything that remained was no longer uncertain. It was simply mine to move forward with. And as I turned off the light and let the evening settle in around me, I knew with complete clarity that there are moments in life that do not ask for resolution. They provide it quietly, completely, leaving nothing behind that needs to be reclaimed. Only a path forward that no longer depends on anyone else to be walked. In this emotionally gripping narrative drawn from powerful family stories, a widowed mother finds herself publicly humiliated during a reading when her own son accuses her in front of their entire extended family, exposing the fragile truth behind years of silent tension and hidden manipulation. As the mother remains composed and refuses to react, the story unfolds with quiet intensity, revealing how dignity and restraint can hold more power than anger, making this one of the most compelling family stories about betrayal, inheritance, and the shifting dynamics between a mother and her son. Through subtle observations and carefully layered moments, the audience is drawn into a world where appearances collapse and true character is revealed not through words, but through actions, placing this narrative among the most thought-provoking family stories that explore respect, control, and the consequences of entitlement. As the legal reading continues, unexpected clauses challenge assumptions and force everyone present to reconsider what they believed, highlighting how carefully constructed decisions can reshape relationships and redefine legacy, further strengthening its place among unforgettable family stories that center on justice, emotional restraint, and moral clarity. By the time the mother walks away, leaving behind not just the room, but the expectations placed upon her, the story delivers a powerful message about self-worth and the importance of being seen for who you truly are, making In one of the most resonant family stories for audiences who value depth, realism, and emotional strength. This is a story about a mother who chose silence over chaos and a son who revealed more than he intended, a reflection of how family stories can uncover the quiet truths that shape our lives and define who we become. Character 1. A 72-year-old white American woman with silver hair neatly styled, wearing an elegant dark formal dress. Front-facing portrait, calm, composed expression, natural lighting, realistic skin texture. No cartoon, no cartoon. No se fi. No ilustración. Character 2. A 45-year-old white American man with sharp features and controlled expression, wearing a tailored navy suit. Front-facing portrait, slight tension in eyes, natural lighting, realistic skin texture. No cartoon, no cartoon. No se fi. No ilustración.